The morning Nora Calloway buried her father, the sky over Delwood County was the kind of blue that makes no promises. She stood at the back of the crowd in her city coat, the one she wore to faculty meetings in Chicago, now dusted with Iowa soil that had worked its way into the fabric during the walk from the parking lot. Around her, men in bib overalls held their hats against their chests and stared at the ground the way farmers always stare at the ground, not out of grief exactly, but out of habit. The earth was where they kept everything that mattered. Gerald Calloway went into that earth on a Tuesday with dirt still under his fingernails from the soybean harvest he never finished. But this story does not begin at the grave. It begins 8 months later in August, when Nora stood at the edge of 300 acres of white buckwheat flowers, while everything around her for 5 miles in every direction had turned the color of death. The corn that Warren Holt had been certain would outlast any drought was brittle and brown, rattling in the hot wind like the bones of something that had given up. The smell of it, sour and dusty and final, hung over Delwood County like a judgment. On Nora's farm, 10 million bees were singing. That is where this story ends. What you need to understand is how it got there and what it cost her to make it happen, and what kind of woman plants a weed in dying soil and turns it into an empire. Go back 9 months. Go back to November, to the farmhouse that smelled of diesel and Old Spice, to the morning after the funeral when Nora walked through her father's bedroom for the first time alone. The room was exactly what she expected and nothing like what she was prepared for. His reading glasses on the nightstand, a water glass with a half-inch of water he would never finish, boots by the door still holding the shape of his feet. She moved through the space the way you move through something sacred and slightly forbidden, touching nothing until she reached the far wall above his dresser. There was a piece of paper pinned there, not framed, not laminated, just an ordinary sheet of notebook paper holding a photocopy of a journal article from 1987. The paper had gone yellow at the edges and soft at the folds from years of humidity and Iowa winters. The title read, "Buckwheat as a Soil Restorative Crop, Nitrogen Fixation, Hardpan Disruption, and Pollinator Yield in Depleted Agricultural Land." In the upper right corner, in her father's handwriting, blue ballpoint pen, slightly cramped the way it always was, "Try this someday." No date, no follow-up notes, just the question mark hanging there for 30-some years while Gerald Calloway kept planting corn, because that was what a man planted in Delwood County, because that was what his father had planted, because the bank knew how to finance corn and the grain elevators knew how to buy it, and the whole apparatus of the valley had been built around the golden idol, and nobody had the time or the courage or the ruin necessary to ask whether the idol had stopped listening. Nora unpinned the paper carefully, folded it once, put it in the inside pocket of her city coat against her chest. She was still standing there when Tommy appeared in the doorway. Her brother was 24 years old and had the hands of a man 20 years older. He had come back from community college at 20 to help their father during what was supposed to be a temporary rough patch, and the rough patch had stretched into 4 years, and the community college acceptance letter had gone into a drawer somewhere and stayed there. Tommy knew every creak in the farmhouse floor, every weak spot in the barn roof, every particular complaint of the ancient John Deere tractor that Gerald had kept running on stubbornness and spare parts ordered from a catalog. What Tommy did not know was how to pay back $2 million. He set a piece of paper on the dresser without a word. Nora picked it up. It was a purchase offer from a residential development company out of Des Moines wanting to buy the Callaway land to build a subdivision. The number printed at the bottom was $1.8 million. It covers almost all of it, Tommy said. We could walk away clean or close to it. Nora looked at the offer. Then she looked at the article in her hand. Not yet, she said. Tommy didn't argue. He just walked out, and his footsteps going down the hall were heavy in a way that had nothing to do with his weight. 3 days later, Nora drove to the First National Bank of Delwood. The meeting had been scheduled by the bank, which meant it had been arranged by Warren Holt, which amounted to the same thing in Delwood County. Holt owned 10,000 acres of prime agricultural land in the Northern Valley, drove a custom Platinum Edition pickup truck, and treated the county agricultural board like it was his personal advisory committee. He had been trying to acquire the Callaway farm for a decade. It was the last piece of land separating his north and south holdings, a gap in his map that he had never been able to close, and Gerald Callaway had refused to sell to him every single year for reasons that were never entirely about money. When Nora walked into the bank manager's office, she noticed that the chair on her side of the table sat approximately 2 inches lower than the chairs on the other side. It was the kind of detail that most people would not catch. Nora caught it immediately because she had spent 10 years in university conference rooms where the same language was spoken without a single word being said. Holt was already seated, his large frame comfortable in the leather chair, his fingers laced across the front of his jacket. He was 60 years old and looked like a man who had never seriously doubted himself, which is a particular kind of look that Nora had learned to read very quickly as a woman in scientific research. Next to him sat Mr. Clement, the bank manager, a soft-faced man in his early 60s who nodded at whatever the last person had said. And in the corner of the room, in a chair that had not been arranged for conversation, sat Carolyn Holt. Nora noticed her the way you notice something that does not quite fit a room. Carolyn was 55, well-dressed in the careful way of a woman who had been told all her life that appearance was a form of respect. She was looking at her hands when Nora came in. She did not look up. She was not introduced. Holt offered his condolences in the tone of a man who had practiced them. Gerald was a good man, stubborn, but good didn't know when to fold. The bank was going to foreclose on Friday. Holt was prepared to step in, clear the debt entirely, and write Nora a check for $50,000 on top of that, enough to go back to Chicago and start over. Mr. Clement nodded vigorously. The land was practically a liability. At this point, he offered helpfully, given the soil depletion. Nora let them finish. Then she opened the manila folder she had been carrying and placed its contents on the table. It was not a plea for extension. It was not a signed transfer document. It was a soil analysis report and a crop rotation schedule she had spent the previous 3 weeks compiling, working from midnight until 4 in the morning at her father's kitchen table while Tommy slept down the hall and the old farmhouse made its settling sounds around her. "I'm not selling Warren," she said. Holt smiled the tolerant smile of a man who had already accounted for this response. "Nora, be reasonable. You don't have the capital for seed let alone the chemicals to force a yield out of that exhausted dirt. What exactly are you planning to plant? Buckwheat, she said. The room went very quiet. Mr. Clement blinked. He looked as though Nora had just announced she intended to farm the surface of the moon. Holt's smile held for 2 seconds longer than it should have, then cracked into something harder. Buckwheat, he repeated. You cannot pay off a $2 million note with pancake flour. That's a cover crop. That's a weed. It's a revitalizer, Nora said, her voice carrying the flat certainty of someone who has done the math and redone it and is done explaining. It grows to harvest in 45 days, requires virtually no nitrogen fertilizer, and thrives in exactly the kind of exhausted, compacted soil that your friend Mr. Clement just described. It also produces an exceptional nectar yield. Holt stood up. He was a large man, and he used his size the way large men in positions of power often do, as punctuation. Nectar, you're talking about bees. 200 hives, Nora said. Yes. She buttoned her jacket and picked up her folder. In the corner of the room, Carolyn Holt had lifted her eyes from her hands. She was looking at the soil analysis report on the table with the focused attention of someone who understood more than her presence in this room was supposed to suggest. For one brief moment, her gaze moved to Nora's face. Then Nora walked out. She was halfway down the block when she heard footsteps behind her, quick and deliberate on the sidewalk. She turned to find Walt Greer standing there. Walt was 70 years old and had farmed the land directly south of the Callaway property for 30 years. He was the quietest man in Delwood County, by general consensus, a man who communicated primarily in nods and the absence of argument. People in town said Walt Greer talked less than his tractor, and they meant it as a compliment to both. He stopped when she stopped and looked at her with the expression of a man choosing words the way a surgeon chooses instruments. That article on Gerald's wall, Walt said, the one about buckwheat and soil restoration. He showed it to me 15 years ago. He paused. I told him it was crazy. Another pause, longer this time. I was wrong. Then he walked away. Nora stood on the sidewalk of Main Street in Delwood, holding her manila folder, and felt something shift in her chest. Not hope exactly, something harder than hope, something her father had carried around for 30 years in the form of a question mark at the top of a yellowed piece of paper. The news moved through Delwood before Nora got back to the farm. By the time she pulled into the driveway, Deb Pruitt was already holding court at the center booth of Mabel's Diner, pouring extra syrup over her waffles and dispensing the verdict to anyone within earshot. She's lost her mind with grief, bless her heart, Deb announced. Buckwheat and bugs. That's her grand strategy to save the Callaway place. I give it 3 months before the bank takes the equipment and Holt gets the land anyway. The men in overalls nodded into their coffee. The whispers followed Nora down the hardware store aisles when she went for supplies. She felt them on the back of her neck, like the particular weight of a community that has already decided you have failed and is simply waiting for the calendar to confirm it. She didn't have time to care about the whispers. The frost was thawing, the ground was softening, and what she needed now was money. She didn't have seeds she hadn't bought, and 200 beehives she had no idea how to manage. The money came from a high-interest microloan she secured through an online lender, using the farmhouse itself as collateral. It was the most frightening thing she had ever signed. If the buckwheat failed, she would not lose just the land. She would lose the house, the kitchen with the height marks her mother had penciled on the door frame every birthday, the porch where her father had sat every evening for 40 years, the particular smell of the place diesel and old wood, and something underneath both of those things that did not have a name but was the smell of continuity of a family rooted somewhere on this earth. Tommy found her at the kitchen table at 2 in the morning with the loan documents spread out in front of her. "If this doesn't work," he said from the doorway. "I know," she said. "I don't have anywhere else to go, Nora." She looked at her brother in the dim kitchen light, at the hands that were too old for his age, at the face that had expected to be somewhere else by now and had made its peace with the fact that it wasn't. "Neither do I," she said. "That's the point." He stood in the doorway another moment, then went back to bed. The next morning he was up at 5:30, repairing the seed broadcaster on the old John Deere without being asked. Edmund Marsh arrived 2 weeks later. He came down the gravel drive in a battered truck, pulling a flatbed trailer stacked with white wooden boxes, and he stepped out of the cab wearing a beekeeper's suit that had been stained to a deep amber color by years of propolis and pine smoke. He was 62 years old, lean and deliberate in his movements, with a gray beard that looked like it had grown without consultation. He stood in the farmyard and looked out at the fields, which were still largely bare brown soil, showing the first faint haze of green that was the buckwheat just beginning to push through the surface. "Dale called me," Ed said, not as greeting but as explanation. Dale was his younger brother, the county sheriff, and apparently Dale had heard about Nora's situation and had opinions about it. "Your brother thought you could help me," Nora said. "My brother thinks I can help everybody," Ed said. "He's usually wrong." He looked at the fields again. 200 hives is a serious operation for a beginner. If those flowers don't come in strong, the colonies starve. You'll have spent everything you borrowed on a very expensive collection of empty wooden boxes. "The flowers are coming," Nora said. She pointed toward the fields. The green was thin, but it was there, spreading across the soil like a rumor gathering confidence. Ed looked at her for a moment with the evaluating attention of a man who has learned to read intention rather than words. Then he began unloading the hives. They placed the boxes in long rows along the tree lines, each entrance facing east, to catch the early morning sun. When the last hive was positioned and Ed removed the entrance reducers, the air changed. A frequency built from nothing, low and resonant and alive, a vibration you felt in your back teeth before you heard it with your ears. 10 million bees took to the air simultaneously, pouring from the white boxes in dark rivers that split and spread and lifted into the April sky. Nora stood in the middle of it without a veil or gloves. The bees moved around her in organized currents, grazing past her face and arms, exploring the new territory without urgency or alarm. She held her arms slightly away from her sides and felt the draft of a million wings on her skin. She had been afraid of this moment for weeks. She had imagined it going wrong in a dozen ways. What she had not anticipated was what it actually felt like, not terror, but something closer to recognition, like stepping into something she had been walking toward without knowing it. Tommy was watching from 50 feet away with his hand on the fence post, and she could feel him watching, and she knew what he was feeling because she had felt it too, that slow, difficult revision of a person you thought you already understood. The timer had started. Dale Marsh found Tommy at the gas station 4 days later, which was not a coincidence because Dale Marsh made a point of finding the people he needed to find. He was 58 years old, quieter than his brother, but harder at the edges, a man shaped by 30 years of watching a county alternate between getting by and falling apart. "Tell your sister to lock the farm gate at night," Dale said. Tommy looked at him. "Why?" "Because somebody's been parking at the pull-off on County Road 12 after dark and looking at her property with a spotlight." Dale filled his own coffee cup at the counter. "Just pass it along." Tommy drove home with that information sitting in his chest. He told himself he would tell Nora that evening. Then he looked at her bent over the soil analysis charts at the kitchen table and thought about everything she was already carrying, and he told himself he would tell her in the morning. Then morning came and the bees needed water troughs, and the John Deere had developed a new rattle, and the moment passed. He did not tell her. That was the mistake he would have to live with. But that part of the story comes later. What came first was the town hall meeting in May when Warren Holt stood at the podium with a bag of store-bought buckwheat flour and slammed it down in front of the microphone hard enough to make half the room flinch. "We are a proud community," Holt said into the microphone, and his eyes were locked on Nora where she sat in the third row. "We feed America. We do not waste productive acreage on what some would call progressive science and what I would call wishful thinking. When buckwheat fields go unmanaged, they spread. They carry pests. They introduce variables into a system that generations of families have built their entire lives around. I call it what it is, folks. It's a weed, and it is a threat to what we have built here." The room murmured agreement. Heads turned toward Nora with expressions ranging from skepticism to open hostility. The hostility had a particular flavor. She recognized not personal hatred exactly, but the communal defensiveness of people whose way of life felt precarious and had found something to blame. Nora stood up. "My crop is entirely legal, Warren," she said, her voice carrying over the murmur without being raised. "It requires no pesticides, which means no chemical runoff into the county water supply. You should be thanking me." "I'll thank you," Holt said, "when I buy your land at the September auction for pennies on the dollar." She walked out with her head up. She did not let anything show on her face until she was through the door and across the parking lot and inside her car with the door closed. Then the weight of it came down. Not just Holt, all of it. The loan documents, the boxes of bees that depended on flowers that had not fully opened yet, the $2 million of debt that pressed on every decision like a thumb on a scale, the house with the height marks on the door frame, Tommy saying he had nowhere else to go. She sat in the dark parking lot and let herself feel the full weight of how badly this could fail. Then she drove home. The next morning she walked out to the fields before the sun was fully up, and what she saw stopped her at the edge of the first row. The buckwheat had come, not gradually, not modestly. It had come the way certain things in nature come all at once and without apology. 300 acres of heart-shaped leaves, the color of new money stretching towards every horizon, and above them just beginning to open millions of small white flowers, lifting their faces to the early light. The scent reached her before she had taken 5 steps into the field. Rich, earthy, sweet, a smell that seemed to come from somewhere older than agriculture. And then she heard it. The bees had found the nectar. The air above the field was not still. It moved with intention, dark with the traffic of 10 million workers in full production. The collective sound of it, something between a hum and a roar, continuous and enormous and alive. Nora pushed her hands into the soil. It gave. The deep roots of the buckwheat had been working on the hard pan. Her father's heavy equipment had compacted over 4 decades of corn, cracking it open, letting air and water back into the places they had been shut out of. The earth was breathing again. She stood up and looked west toward the horizon. The sky was wrong. She had grown up in Iowa. She knew spring skies. They were supposed to be volatile and dramatic, full of the dark bottom clouds that rolled in from the northwest, carrying the rain that the whole valley's agriculture depended on. What stretched above her instead was a flat, unchanging pale blue, bleached out at the edges, and the wind that reached her face was dry and already too warm for the hour. It was the middle of May. The buckwheat was blooming, the bees were working, and no rain was coming. She did not say anything to Tommy that morning. She went inside and made coffee and sat at the kitchen table with the soil charts and the weather data she had pulled from the State Agricultural Service and the number that kept appearing in her calculations, 74, the number of days the meteorological models were suggesting the current high-pressure system could hold. 74 days without rain in corn country. She folded the weather printout in half and put it under the stack of loan documents and went back outside to check the water troughs for the hives. There was nothing to do about the sky except be the kind of crop that didn't need it. The drought did not arrive the way disasters are supposed to arrive. It did not announce itself. It simply stayed. The high-pressure dome that the meteorologists had been cautiously discussing in their weekly bulletins through late May became by the middle of June a geological fact, as permanent seeming as the land itself, and the farmers of Dellwood County moved through the early weeks of it, the way people move through the early stages of any slow catastrophe, with denial that is not quite dishonest, because the mind requires time to accept what the body already knows. Warren Holt was still projecting confidence at Mabel's Diner the second week of June. He dropped a $100 bill on the counter for a $4 coffee and told anyone within earshot that his pivot irrigation system could outlast a desert. His fields were a marvel of engineering, miles of aluminum pipe walking across the landscape on wheeled towers, pulling from the deep aquifer and spraying thousands of gallons a day onto the dark green corn that was just beginning its critical growth phase. What Holt had not accounted for, because no one in Dellwood had ever needed to account for it, was what happened when every farmer in the county ran their deepest pumps simultaneously for 60 consecutive days. The aquifer began to drop, not quickly at first, a foot a week, then 2, then the rate of decline accelerating as July arrived with temperatures that sat stubbornly above 95 degrees even after midnight, and the soil baked into a surface that cracked in geometric patterns like something drawn by a machine. Wells that had flowed reliably for 50 years began pulling up sediment, then mud, then one by one nothing at all. Holt's pivot systems ground to a halt on a Thursday morning in mid-July. His foreman, Roy Stacker, called it in from the south field, and Holt drove out himself in the Platinum truck to stand at the edge of 10,000 acres of corn that had just lost its water supply at the exact moment when a corn plant needs water more than at any other point in its existence. The tassels were out, the silks were forming, the ears were setting. Every biological process happening inside those stalks required water that was no longer coming. He stood there for a long time without speaking. The transformation of the county over the following 2 weeks was the kind of thing that stays in a person's memory, not as a series of events, but as a single sustained image. The corn did what corn does under extreme heat stress. The leaves curled inward along their length, rolling into tight tubes to reduce their surface area, a last biological negotiation with an environment that had stopped negotiating. The color went out of them by degrees, green to pale green to yellow, to a brittle, dusty brown that caught the light wrong, that did not shine the way living things shine. The smell was the worst part. Dying corn has a smell unlike anything else in agriculture, sour and starchy and final, and in July it hung over the entire valley from horizon to horizon. Men who had worked this land for 30 and 40 years stood at field edges and did not speak. Some of them had their hands in their pockets. Some of them had their arms crossed over their chests, as though holding themselves together. Deb Pruitt stopped talking about Nora Calloway entirely. The diner grew quiet in the way that places grow quiet when the news is too large for conversation. Foreclosure notices began appearing on the bulletin board outside the feed store, pinned up with the same thumbtacks that had held harvest party announcements and tractor for sale ads for as long as anyone could remember. On the Calloway farm, the buckwheat was in full production. Nora was not watching the county die with any satisfaction. She was working 16-hour days with the focused intensity of someone who knows exactly how fragile her own position remains, even as the situation around her shifts in her favor. The bees were in full summer production, with the buckwheat at peak bloom, the colonies building honey stores at a rate that Ed described one evening over the water trough as something he had never personally witnessed in 4 decades of beekeeping. In a drought year, a colony normally burns through its stores trying to survive, Ed said. He was looking down the row of white boxes with an expression that had more reverence in it than Nora had seen on his face before. They forage further, they work harder, they consume more than they produce, but your buckwheat is the only serious nectar source for miles now. Every bee within foraging range that isn't in your hives is visiting your flowers. The flow is historic. I don't have a better word for it. It was the night after that conversation that Carolyn Holt came to the farm. Nora heard the car on the gravel and stepped onto the porch to find Carolyn walking up from the driveway alone, no headlights, as though she had cut them at the end of the road to avoid being seen from the highway. She was wearing plain clothes, nothing like the careful presentation she had maintained at the bank meeting, and her hands were clasped in front of her with a tension that her face was working to conceal. "I'm not here for Warren," Carolyn said before Nora could speak. "I want to be clear about that first." "Come in," Nora said. They sat at the kitchen table. Tommy appeared briefly in the hallway, read the room, and disappeared back toward his bedroom with the social intelligence of a man who has learned when to be absent. Carolyn did not accept coffee or pleasantries. She had the manner of someone who has made a decision that took a long time to reach and does not want the arrival of second thoughts. Warren has taken a third mortgage on the South Acreage, she said. He hasn't told anyone. The paperwork went through a title company in Des Moines rather than Clements Bank because he didn't want it on record locally. He leveraged against projected corn values that no longer exist. She paused. If the cattle die, the whole structure collapses, not just the south fields, all of it. Nora held very still. Why are you telling me this? Because when he comes here, Carolyn said, and her voice had a certainty in it that suggested she had thought through every possible version of the next few weeks, and he will come here. He is going to try to make it seem like he is asking a favor between neighbors. I want you to know what he is actually asking. I want you to know the full weight of what you will be holding. She stood up without waiting for a response. One more thing, Carolyn said at the door. The soil analysis you put on that table at the bank. I've read enough agricultural reports in 20 years of signing my husband's papers to recognize good science. My father farmed 200 acres in Minnesota. He sold out to a conglomerate in 1994 and regretted it until the day he died. She looked at Nora steadily. Don't sell. Then she walked out to her car and drove away without turning on the headlights until she reached the county road. Tommy materialized in the kitchen doorway approximately 45 seconds after the sound of the car faded. I heard, he said. I know you heard. She's right that he's coming. Tommy sat down in the chair Carolyn had vacated. He turned his coffee mug in his hands. When he does, what are you going to ask for? Nora had been thinking about this since the bank meeting in November. She had been thinking about it more specifically since the afternoon she had unrolled the county plat map in the barn and spent an hour with a pencil and a ruler. She told Tommy what she had been thinking. He listened without interrupting, which was how she knew he was taking it seriously. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "He'll call it extortion." "He'll sign it anyway," Nora said. She was right about both things. Warren Holt came on a Wednesday afternoon in late July when the temperature gauge nailed to the barn wall read 102 degrees in the shade. Nora was in the barn working on the radial extractor she had bought in pieces from a farm equipment liquidation auction and spent the better part of 3 weeks reassembling. She heard the truck before she saw it, the familiar sound of the Platinum Edition engine, but when she looked up, the truck was not platinum anymore. It was the color of the Drought gray-brown with accumulated dust that had worked into every seam and panel, and the man stepping out of it looked like he had been carrying something very heavy for a long time. Holt stopped in the doorway of the barn. He did not come in. He looked at Nora the way a man looks at something when pride and necessity are directly at war, and necessity is winning. "I need water," he said. Just those 3 words. No preamble, no maneuvering, no performance of casual neighborliness. "My South Aquifer collapsed yesterday. I have 500 head of cattle that will start dying by tomorrow morning if I don't find water." He paused. "Your father's artesian well is still flowing. I've seen it." Nora set down her wrench. She wiped her hands on a shop rag and looked at the man who had brought a bag of buckwheat flour to a town hall meeting and slammed it on a podium as a joke with her as the punchline. "You told the town I was a threat to their livelihoods, Warren," she said. "I was wrong." The words came out like something physical being removed from his chest. "My crops are dead. The bank is calling my operating loans. If I lose the cattle, I lose the collateral on the third mortgage, and then I lose everything that comes with it." He looked past her toward the fields that were humming and white and impossibly alive. "Name your price." Nora walked to the overturned wooden crate that served as her desk and picked up the county plat map she had rolled up and set there 3 days ago when she decided she was done thinking about it and ready to act. She unrolled it on the crate top and pointed to a pale yellow rectangle in the eastern section of the map. "The South Ridge Tract," she said, "500 acres, bordering my eastern fence line. I want the deed transferred to the Callaway Trust." The color left Holt's face the way water leaves a dry stream bed, quickly and completely. "That land is worth $2 million in a good year. It's worth a great deal less than 500 dead Angus cattle, plus whatever your creditors do when the third mortgage triggers." She held his gaze. "You told my father that sentimentality doesn't pay the mortgage. You were right. Neither does pride." She folded the map. "You have until sundown." For a long moment, the only sound in the barn was the distant continuous hum of the hives through the open door and the metallic drip of oil from the extractor housing. The veins in Holt's neck stood out. His jaw worked. 40 years of being the most powerful man in the Northern Valley was visibly and audibly breaking apart somewhere in his chest. "I'll have my attorney draft the transfer tonight," he said. His voice had gone rough. "One more thing," Nora said. "Come spring, you dedicate 20% of your remaining acreage to cover crops, crimson clover or hairy vetch. My bees need early season forage, and your soil needs nitrogen that doesn't come from a bag." He walked out without answering, but he did not say no. By noon the following day, the county watched a convoy of flatbed trucks from a pipe supply company unspool 3 miles of heavy black irrigation tubing from the Callaway property across the parched county line and straight into Holt's cattle operation. When Nora threw the lever on the old artesian pump and the ancient diesel motor turned over with a cough and a roar, cold clear water surged through the black pipe and into Holt's steel troughs. It was the only running water for 40 miles. Tommy stood beside her watching the pipe fill. He did not say anything for a while. Then, "Walt Greer is parked at the end of the road. He's been sitting there for an hour." Nora looked down the gravel lane. Walt's rust-colored truck was pulled off onto the shoulder, and Walt himself was visible as a silhouette behind the windshield watching. "He's counting," Nora said. "Counting what?" "Everything he told my father was impossible," she said. She walked back toward the barn. "Leave him alone. Let him count." The shift in the county after the water pipeline went in was subtle at first and then not subtle at all. Men who had looked through Nora at the hardware store started nodding when she passed. Deb Pruitt refilled her coffee without being asked during a brief stop at the diner. Walt Greer left a case of engine oil on the Callaway porch one morning without knocking, which was as close as Walt Greer came to a declaration of solidarity. But Ed Marsh felt something the rest of them were too relieved to notice. He came to the porch one evening in the first week of August and sat on the steps with a piece of pine he had been whittling, and the bees were audible from the fields, even at this distance, a constant low frequency that had become the background music of the farm. Ed held the piece of wood but did not whittle. He was listening to something else. "The tone is off," he said. Nora came out with 2 glasses of iced tea and sat in the other chair. "What do you mean?" "The pitch of the hives. It's been shifting for 3 days. Bees read the environment in ways we can't. They're picking up stress." He took the glass. "I was in town this morning getting mesh screen. The looks I got weren't just unfriendly." He turned the piece of pine in his hands. "I've been doing this a long time. I know what a county looks like when it's about to do something stupid." "They're scared," Nora said. "The bank foreclosed on 3 more operations this week." "Scared men do stupid things," Ed said. "Keep your eyes open." She heard it 3 nights later at 2 in the morning. Not an engine, not voices. What woke her was a sound she had never heard the hives make before, a chaotic, layered roar that was wrong in the way that a human voice is wrong when the person making it is in pain. She was out of bed with her boots on before she was fully conscious, and her hand found the Remington 8.7 on its pegs beside the bedroom door, the way her hand had found it in darkness 100 times since she was a child, because that was where Gerald Calloway had always kept it, and it had never moved. She ran. Coming over the small rise above the east field, she stopped running, and her heart stopped with her. 2 trucks were parked along the tree line with their lights off. 4 figures moved between the hive rows in the dark, and even from this distance she could see the shapes of the backpack sprayer rigs they were carrying, and she could smell it, the sharp chemical bite of organophosphate insecticide cutting through the warm night air. They were not here for the honey. "Ed!" she screamed. The light in the airstream came on instantly, and Ed appeared with an iron crowbar that he had apparently kept nearby for reasons he had never explained. The 4 figures froze at the sound of her voice. "Keep going!" a voice shouted from the darkness. She recognized it immediately. Roy Stacker Holt's former foreman, laid off 3 weeks prior, when Holt began liquidating his labor costs. Roy's rage had been looking for a place to land and had found one. "You're killing this county, Nora." Roy's voice cracked with a fury that had been building through weeks of helplessness and loss and the particular torment of watching someone else succeed where everything around him had failed. "Your weeds and your bugs, you're sucking the life out of all of us. We're ending it tonight." He raised the spray wand toward the nearest double-deep hive. Nora racked the Remington. In the dead Iowa night, the sound of that action carried across the field and into the trees and back again. It is a sound that anyone who has ever heard it in the dark knows is not a suggestion. "Drop the sprayers right now, Roy, or I put buckshot through your engine block." Roy did not drop the wand. He swung it toward the hive. She fired. The blast took out the front right tire of Roy's truck with a sound that rolled across the valley like the whole summer breaking at once. The truck dropped onto its rim with a grinding crash. The 3 men with Roy threw their rigs into the dirt and raised their hands. Roy stumbled backwards, staring at his ruined tire, the wand dangling from his grip. Then the sirens. Dale Marsh's cruiser came down the gravel drive with the lights going red and blue, throwing fractured shadows across the standoff. He had been running a patrol on County Road 12, and the shot had carried. He stepped out of the car with one hand on his belt and took in the scene with the practiced economy of a man who has been arriving at bad situations for 30 years. "Sheriff," Nora said. Her hands were steady. The rest of her was not. "Roy Stacker and 3 others trespassing and attempting to deploy unregistered chemical agents against my livestock." Roy tried to step forward. Dale pointed at him without turning his head. "Don't." He looked at the sprayer rigs lying in the dirt. He looked at Roy. The expression on his face was not anger, but something colder and more useful. "Hands on the hood," Dale said. "All 4 of you. Now." While Dale worked, Ed walked the hive row with a smoker checking each box. The air carried the sharp banana scent of alarm pheromone, the chemical signal the colonies had been broadcasting, but the boxes were intact and the poison had not been deployed. Ed pressed his palm against the side of the nearest hive and held it there, feeling the vibration from inside. "They're all right," he said. He looked back at Nora with something in his face she had not seen from him before. "You got here in time." As the 4 men were folded into the back of the cruiser, Nora lowered the shotgun and let herself feel the weakness in her knees that adrenaline had been masking for the past several minutes. She sat down on the ground right where she was standing, the Remington across her lap, and looked out over the dark field where the hives glowed faintly in the starlight, alive and intact. Tommy appeared from the direction of the house running, having slept through the shot and woken to the sirens. He stopped when he saw her sitting on the ground. "What happened?" he asked. "Roy Stacker," she said. Tommy looked at the ruined truck with the blown tire sitting crookedly on its rim. He looked at the sprayer rigs scattered in the dirt. He was quiet for a long moment. "Dale told me weeks ago," Tommy said, "that someone was watching the property at night. I didn't tell you." He stopped. "I'm sorry." She looked at her brother in the red and blue light, still pulsing from the cruiser. She thought about saying several things, then she said the only one that mattered. "Help me check the east row." They walked the hive line together in silence, Tommy holding the flashlight, Nora checking each entrance for the steady traffic that meant normal activity inside. All 200 boxes were intact. At the end of the row, Tommy stopped and turned off the flashlight, and they stood in the dark, listening to the hives breathe. "When we were kids," Tommy said, "I used to think Dad was stubborn because he was afraid of change." He paused. "I think now he was just waiting for the right change." Nora did not answer, but she reached over and briefly squeezed her brother's arm, the same gesture she would have made at 10 years old and at 20 and at 32, standing at his graveside, the particular shorthand of a family that does not perform its feelings but carries them. The great drought broke on September 12th with a storm that had no gradual arrival. It came with full thunder and in 2 hours put 3 inches of rain on the cracked earth of Delwood County. For the corn farmers, it was precisely the mercy that came too late, and the rain turned their dead fields into a gray soup that made it nearly impossible to get equipment in for the salvage tillage. The water that should have been the growing season ran off land that had lost the biological structure to hold it. On the Callaway farm, the harvest timing was exact. The buckwheat had completed its cycle. The flowers had given way to dark triangular seeds, heavy on their reddish stalks, and the rain softened the soil to perfect working depth, just as the combine needed it. because the drought had sterilized the topsoil of competing weed seeds. The Callaway buckwheat had grown in uncontested dominance across all 300 acres. The honey extraction took 4 full days. Ed brought in 2 additional people he trusted to work the frames, and they converted the insulated barn into a processing space, every surface covered with the dark, heavy frames, the capping knives moving hot and precise, the centrifuge spinning in cycles that filled the air with a smell unlike any other, the particular rich, dark sweetness of buckwheat honey, earthy and deep, nothing like the mild, pale product that came in plastic bears at grocery stores. This was mahogany-colored, thick as molasses, with a flavor that carried notes of chocolate and iron, and something that tasted, if a taste can be described this way, like the specific kind of effort it takes to grow something beautiful out of ruined ground. When the last frame was spun and the centrifuge shut down, Nora and Ed stood in the center of the barn, surrounded by 55-gallon drums filled with dark liquid. Ed put his hand on the nearest drum and looked at the row of them. 38,000 pounds, he said quietly. He had calculated it 3 times. Marcus Taft flew in from Seattle 2 days later. He was the head of procurement for a large organic distributor, and he arrived wearing a suit that had no relationship to any Iowa context, and he dipped a tasting spoon into an open drum and closed his eyes. The regional clover crop failed entirely this year, Taft said, still looking at the middle distance with the expression of a man doing serious arithmetic. Supply chains for premium honey are empty from coast to coast. You have just produced a commercial-scale volume of medicinal-grade buckwheat honey. He looked at Nora. What are you asking? She told him. He did not negotiate. When she worked out the number on a piece of scrap paper from the barn wall, her hand shook hard enough that she had to put the pencil down and press her palm flat on the table and breathe for a moment before she could continue. The honey alone exceeded $250,000 at the wholesale rate Taft was offering, which was 3 times the national average. Combined with the buckwheat seed sale to a Minneapolis flour mill that was short on supply and willing to pay accordingly, the total revenue from a single drought-stricken season exceeded every year of her father's farming life. She drove to the bank on a Monday morning. Mr. Clement was behind his mahogany desk, looking smaller and older than he had in November, which was not surprising given what his institution was currently managing in terms of defaults and delinquencies across the county. When Nora sat down and slid the certified cashier's check across the desk, he picked it up with both hands and read the number on it with the expression of a man encountering a document that contradicts everything his professional life has taught him to expect. Miss Callaway, he said, this covers the microloan, the operational taxes, and stabilizes your father's note entirely. He looked up at her. How? Buckwheat and bees, Nora said. She reached into her bag and placed a thick blue-covered legal document on top of the check. I'll also need you to update the county plat records for the Callaway Trust. We're absorbing the South Ridge tract. The deed transfer was notarized by Warren Holt's attorneys last week. Clement's pen rolled off the desk and hit the floor. He looked at the deed, then at Nora, then back at the deed, and in the settling of his expression was the precise moment when he understood that the power structure of Delwood County had been rewritten while he was watching the ceiling for signs of rain. When Nora walked out of the bank onto Main Street, Deb Pruitt was sweeping the sidewalk in front of the diner. She stopped with the broom in her hands and looked at Nora for a long moment with an expression that had something genuine in it, not quite apology, something harder earned than apology. She nodded. Walt Greer drove past in his rust-colored truck and raised 2 fingers off the steering wheel in the old farmer's acknowledgement that means more than most words. They did not laugh anymore. That evening, Tommy found Nora at the kitchen table with a glass of water and the leather-bound ledger she had bought in September to replace the manila folder of crisis management. She was writing numbers in it with an unhurried hand, expansion plans, soil rotation schedules for the next 3 years, the acreage of the South Ridge Tract, and what it would take to restore it. 800 acres, a viable operation, the beginning of something that didn't have a name yet. Tommy set his own coffee down across from her and sat. "I owe you a conversation," he said. "You owe me a lot of things," Nora said, not unkindly. "I know." He looked at the ledger. "I want to learn it. The soil science, the bee biology, the cover crop rotation. Whatever it is you're building here." He paused. "Dad understood it, but he never had time to do it. You understand it and you're doing it. I want to know how." She looked at her brother for a moment. Then she turned the ledger around and pushed it toward him. "Start on page 4, she said. "The cover crop nitrogen data. Tell me what you think we're missing." Tommy pulled the ledger toward him and opened it. 3 weeks later, at the kitchen table in the same house, Nora's phone showed a notification from the Des Moines Register. Tommy was asleep. Ed was in his Airstream at the tree line. The farm was quiet with the deep quiet of a place that has earned its rest. She read the headline twice before she understood it fully. Omni Agri Sciences acquires 4,000 acres of distressed agricultural land in Delwood County. She set the phone face down on the table. She got up, put on her coat, and walked outside into the cold November air. The fields were bare now, the buckwheat harvested, the cover crops newly seeded across the South Ridge acreage that had taken 3 weeks of effort to prepare. The hives were wrapped for winter, silent, the colonies clustered inside, doing what they do in winter, generating heat, surviving waiting. She stood in the dark and did the math she already knew the answer to. 4,000 acres, surrounding her on every side, a company that measured agricultural land not in generations but in quarterly returns, that had never asked what the soil wanted or what the water table could sustain or what a community needed to stay alive. She had beaten the drought. She had beaten Warren Holt. What was coming in the spring was something entirely different, something that did not lose and did not care and had never been embarrassed in a bank office or stood in a barn doorway with its hat in its hand. She went inside, woke Tommy, and told him to call Iris Sondergaard in the morning. Preston Webb arrived on the coldest Tuesday of February, when the frost had locked the ground to a depth that made it ring like iron under a boot heel, and the sky had the flat white quality of a ceiling rather than a sky. His SUV was black and clean in a way that nothing in Delwood County was clean in February, and he stepped out of it in a cashmere overcoat and looked at the Callaway farmhouse with eyes that were performing a calculation rather than taking in a view. Nora was on the porch with a mug of coffee when he came up the walk. She had seen the SUV from the kitchen window and had taken her time coming out, which was a small thing but intentional. Miss Calloway. Webb had the smile of a man who had been trained to deploy it as a tool. Richard Preston Webb, I represent OmniAgra Sciences. Your operation has generated some significant interest in our regional reports. I know who you are, Nora said. She did not offer her hand or the other chair. Webb produced a folded document from his coat pocket. With the practiced ease of someone who has done this many times in many driveways and has never been refused, he held it out. OmniAgra has acquired 4,100 acres in this quadrant. Your property sits at the geographic center of our development grid. We'd like to make that a clean acquisition. Nora took the document. She opened it to the summary page, read the number printed in bold at the top, and handed it back without opening the rest. $3.5 million. The farm isn't for sale, she said. Webb's smile held with professional endurance. That's a significant offer, Miss Calloway, above market for this county by a considerable margin. My father spent 40 years keeping this land out of the hands of people who think topsoil is a disposable input, Nora said. I'm not going to undo his life's work to add a decimal point to your quarterly numbers. The smile went away. What replaced it was not hostility exactly, but the particular blankness of a man shifting from one mode of operation to another. He let the document fall against his leg, not dropping it, holding it with a looseness that suggested he was done presenting it as an offer and was now presenting it as a context. You should understand the operational reality here, Webb said. His voice had dropped a register. When our planting season begins, we'll be applying our proprietary herbicide program across the entire quadrant. Your bees will forage into our fields. They will encounter our chemistry. The colony losses will be significant. He paused to let that settle. Additionally, our aerial application schedule will create drift conditions. If that drift contacts your certified organic acreage, your certification is void. Your premium contracts are void. The entire value proposition of your operation disappears. Nora looked at him steadily. You're threatening to kill my livestock and destroy my business. I'm explaining the agricultural chemistry of adjacency, Webb said. You have 30 days to reconsider. The offer stands. He set the document on the porch railing and walked back to his SUV and drove away, and the sound of the engine faded into the flat white sky, and Nora stood on the porch holding her coffee mug in both hands until the cold drove her inside. She called Iris Sondergaard before she reached the kitchen table. Iris drove up from Ames the same evening, arriving after dark with her laptop and a rolled topographical map under her arm. She had been expecting this call in the way that scientists who pay attention to patterns expect things not with pleasure, but with the grim satisfaction of a prediction confirmed. She spread the map on the kitchen table, and Tommy pulled his chair around to her side without being asked, which was how the household had reorganized itself over the past several weeks. Tommy, moving from the periphery of decisions to their center, not by assertion but by steady presence and the accumulating evidence that he intended to stay. Neonicotinoids are the standard for soybean production at this scale, Iris said, her finger tracing the property boundaries. They're systemic. They persist in soil and pollen. If Omniagra is running a full-acre herbicide and insecticide program on 4,000 acres surrounding your 800, the contamination risk isn't speculative, it's a matter of wind direction and timing. What's the regulatory exposure for them? Tommy asked. The EPA has buffer zone requirements and wind speed limits for aerial application, Iris said, but enforcement is complaint-driven, and corporate legal teams are very good at making complaints expensive and slow. She looked at Nora. A litigation strategy could take 5 years and bankrupt you before it resolved. So we don't litigate, Nora said. We prevent. She sat down at the table and looked at the map for a long time without speaking. Tommy and Iris waited. Ed had arrived at some point during the conversation, coming in through the back without knocking, and he was standing at the counter with his arms crossed, looking at the map with the focused attention of a man who has spent 40 years reading environments. Ed, Nora said, if we split the hives now, early spring, how many can we bring to 400? Ed looked up. Queens are coming into their spring laying cycle. If we feed them heavy syrup to stimulate comb production, I could do the splits over 3 weeks, maybe 400 colonies, maybe a few more. He paused. Why? Nora picked up the red marker from the table and drew a line around the entire perimeter of her property, the exact boundary where her 800 acres met Omniagra's new holdings on every side. Because we're going to put them here, she said, on the fence line. All of them. She drew a second line wider, just inside the first. And here we plant sunflowers, giant Russian variety, the ones that come up to 6 feet in 8 weeks, and borage, dense, continuous along every edge of this property where it touches theirs. Iris leaned forward. The leaf mass would intercept drift before it reaches the interior fields. That's part of it, Nora said. The other part is that if you give a bee a rich food source 20 feet from the hive, she takes it. She doesn't fly 3 miles into a soybean field when there's a wall of sunflowers at her doorstep. We're not just blocking chemistry, we're redirecting biology. Dale Marsh, who had come in sometime after Ed without Nora noticing, was standing in the doorway between the kitchen and the hall. He had a habit of arriving at conversations already in progress, which his brother had long ago accepted as a feature of his personality rather than a peculiarity. I can put environmental monitoring equipment on the county road, Dale said. Wind speed direction, chemical particulate sensors. If they run a spray operation outside legal parameters, I have real-time data, not a complaint made 2 weeks after the fact. Tommy looked at Dale. Can you do that without them knowing? It's county road, Dale said. I can put whatever I like on county road. The plan that took shape at that kitchen table over the next 2 hours was not a plan that any one of them could have built alone. It required Ed's knowledge of colony biology and the precise timing of spring splits. It required Iris's understanding of chemical drift physics and the specific leaf density needed to function as a biological net. It required Dale's jurisdictional access to the road monitoring positions that would give them evidentiary standing. It required Tommy's mechanical aptitude and his willingness to drive equipment for 20-hour days without complaint. And it required what Nora had been building since November of the previous year, the accumulated trust of a community that had once dismissed her and had since revised its opinion in the particular way that Midwestern communities revise opinions without ceremony and without apology, but completely. She went to Mabel's diner the following morning. Deb Pruitt was behind the counter at 6:30 when Nora came in, and the diner had the particular early morning population of farmers and old men who have nowhere they need to be, but who rise early out of 40 years of habit. Walt Greer was in his usual corner booth, his coffee untouched and still steaming. Two other farmers whose names Nora knew sat at the counter with the manner of men waiting for something to be decided. Nora did not sit down. She stood near the door and said what she had come to say, which was that Omniagra was not done with Delwood County and would not be done with it until either they got what they came for or the community made the cost of staying higher than the value of the acquisition. She said that what she needed was 3 weeks of labor seed drills and people willing to work. She was still talking when the door opened behind her. She turned to find Warren Holt standing in the entrance of Mabel's diner, not in the Platinum truck, which he no longer drove but on foot, having walked from wherever he had parked, wearing a denim jacket with no insignia and carrying nothing. He looked around the room with the expression of a man who knows he is not entirely welcome and has decided to come anyway, which is a different thing from confidence and requires something harder. The room was very quiet. "I heard you need seed drills and labor," Holt said. He looked at Nora. "I've got a flatbed with 400 pounds of organic crimson clover. I also know how to operate every piece of equipment you're likely to need." He paused. "I'm not here because I enjoy it. I'm here because a Chicago spreadsheet operation buying up this valley is worse than losing to you, and I know it." Walt Greer picked up his coffee mug and drank from it, which was Walt's way of indicating that the matter was settled. Deb Pruitt untied her apron. "I'll run food. Tell me how many people and what time." The work took 3 weeks, and it was the kind of work that changes people without their noticing at the time. They planted the sunflower and borage perimeter in sections working from the western boundary, eastward running seed drills in parallel rows until the entire 50-foot buffer strip around the farm's 800 acres was seeded. Ed worked the hive splits with the methodical intensity of a surgeon moving through the rows in the early morning cold, finding the right frames, relocating queens, building new colonies from the genetic material of the strongest ones. Tommy ran logistics, moving equipment and supplies between crews, troubleshooting the seed drills when they jammed on the still frozen subsoil, keeping the operation moving through weather that swung between 30 degrees and 60 over the course of a single afternoon. Carolyn Holt appeared on the third day, not with Warren separately driving herself in a car that was not the family vehicle. She found Nora at the western fence line checking the germination rate of the first borage seeding and said without preliminary that she wanted to help with whatever the educational component of the operation would eventually be. She had been a teacher before she married Warren, she said. Junior high science, 9 years. She had missed it. Nora looked at her. "When this is over," she said, "come talk to me about what that would look like." Carolyn nodded once, turned, and walked back to her car. By the last week of May, the sunflowers were at 6 feet and climbing a dense green barrier around the entire perimeter that rustled in the spring wind with a sound like something rehearsing its own strength. The buckwheat in the interior fields was in early bloom. the white flowers just beginning to open, and the 400 colonies along the fence line were vibrating with a population density that Ed said he had never achieved this early in a season. The sugar syrup feeding through the winter had done its work. OmniAgra's GPS-guided tractors had been visible for weeks on the surrounding acreage, sterile gray machines moving in perfect parallel lines, without human operators preparing the chemically treated seedbed for their GMO soybean program. The absence of people in those cabs had a quality that was difficult to name, but easy to feel. It looked like the future that the valley would become if the current operation failed. Preston Webb was still in the county. He had rented office space in the building above the hardware store and could occasionally be seen on Main Street in his cashmere coat, speaking into his phone, not engaging with anyone locally, conducting the business of acquisition in the way that large organizations conduct it at a distance from the human cost. The aerial application came on a Tuesday afternoon when the wind had been building steadily from the west for 4 hours. Nora was at the eastern fence line checking hive entrances when she heard it, the low agricultural drone of a crop duster dropping altitude as it cleared the OmniAgra tree line. She walked quickly to the barn for a respirator, and by the time she reached the western fence line, where Ed was already standing with his own respirator on the plane, was visible yellow against the pale sky, flying low enough that she could see the spray booms extending from its wings, trailing a white chemical cloud that the west wind immediately began to push eastward. Webb was parked on the county road, shoulder 200 yards away, watching through the windshield. The chemical cloud reached the sunflower perimeter in 40 seconds. What happened next was something that Nora would spend years afterward trying to describe accurately, because accuracy mattered to her in a way that drama did not, and the accurate description of what she witnessed required acknowledging that nature does not perform on behalf of human narratives. It simply operates according to its own logic, which sometimes under specific conditions produces outcomes that look like they were staged. The sunflower leaves caught the chemical drift the way a dense thicket catches thrown water. The larger droplets lost their momentum in the first 2 rows of vegetation and fell to the soil inside the buffer zone. What passed through was a fraction dispersed and diluted, carrying nothing like sufficient concentration to cross the remaining distance to the buckwheat interior. But the colonies had been reading the situation for several minutes before the plane appeared. Bees sense barometric pressure, electromagnetic fields, chemical signals in the air at concentrations far below human detection thresholds. The 400 colonies along the western fence had been receiving chemical information from the approaching spray cloud for longer than anyone standing at the fence line had known the plane was coming. When the rotor noise crossed the threshold that the guard bees registered as a predator threat and the chemical signature simultaneously peaked, the response was not individual but collective, not decision but reflex, the same reflex that has kept Apis mellifera alive through ice ages and extinctions and the full catastrophic history of the natural world. The hives opened, not gradually, all at once, every colony simultaneously, the way a crowd rises when something unexpected happens, and the air over the western fence line went dark with the density of what emerged. tens of thousands of bees in the first second, hundreds of thousands in the first 10 seconds, a mass of organized life that rose into the space between the sunflower perimeter and the approaching plane with a velocity and volume that had nothing performative about it and was more frightening for that reason. The crop duster pilot encountered the swarm at 50 feet of altitude during an active spray run. What he experienced in the cockpit in the next 8 seconds was the windshield going dark, the sound of impact on every external surface, the specific terror of a pilot who cannot see the ground and is trying to remember exactly where the tree line is, and the professional calculation that the risk of continuing vastly exceeded any instruction he had been given on the ground. He pulled up hard and immediately killed the spray booms, banked west, and did not return. Webb stepped out of his SUV. He stood on the county road shoulder watching his aerial operation disappear over the horizon and the sunflower perimeter standing intact and the dark mass of the swarm beginning its slow, organized return to the hive rows, the individual bees dropping back into the white boxes in their thousands like a tide reversing, and behind the perimeter, the white flowers of the buckwheat interior still moving undisturbed in the afternoon wind. Dale Marsh's cruiser rolled to a stop directly behind Webb's SUV. Dale got out and walked to Webb's window with the unhurried gait of a man who has all the time and all the evidence he needs. "Mr. Webb, I have particulate and wind monitoring data from 3 stations on this road showing sustained wind speeds of 14 miles per hour at the time of application, which exceeds the EPA maximum of 10 miles per hour for aerial herbicide deployment by 40%. Dale's voice was conversational, the way it gets when the situation is beyond argument. That's a federal violation of the Clean Air Act and the Federal Insecticide, Fungicide, and Rodenticide Act simultaneously. I've already sent the data to the regional EPA office and the Iowa Department of Agriculture. He paused. I'd recommend you start thinking about whether OmniAgra wants to add criminal exposure to what's about to become a significant civil liability. Webb looked out the windshield at the sunflower wall. Then he looked at Iris Sondergaard standing 30 feet away with a laptop showing sensor readings in real time, and at Tommy Calloway beside her noting something in a field notebook, and at Ed Marsh walking the hive rows with a smoker, and at Nora Calloway standing at the western fence line looking back at him with an expression that was not triumph and was not anger. It was the expression of a person who has been through enough that the outcome no longer surprises them, who fought because the thing was worth fighting for, and won because they had done the preparation that winning requires. Webb got back in his SUV. He made a call. He drove away. He did not come back. The OmniAgra withdrawal from Delwood County happened over the following 6 weeks without announcement or press release. The company's legal exposure from the documented spray violation was significant, and the cost-benefit analysis of pursuing an acquisition against an operation that had demonstrated both the will and the means to defend itself legally and biologically was not a calculation that resolved in OmniAgra's favor. The 4,100 acres they had purchased went to market in August, and because the Delwood County situation had generated attention in agricultural law circles, that Omniagra did not want to amplify. With a second contested sale, the asking price was adjusted to a level that made a different kind of buyer possible. The Dellwood Agricultural Cooperative was formed in September, a legal entity structured by Dale's attorney referral and built on a governance model that Iris had adapted from 3 existing cooperative frameworks in the Midwest. Its founding members included Nora Calloway, Warren Holt, Walt Greer, and 11 other farm families whose operations had survived the drought in varying states of damage. The cooperative acquired the Omniagra acreage at a price that individual members could manage through a structured land trust arrangement that Nora had spent the better part of 2 months designing with the help of an agricultural attorney in Des Moines. It was not a perfect instrument, nothing built by 11 farming families and 2 lawyers under time pressure is, but it was theirs and it held. 5 years passed. The changes that 5 years make to a landscape and a community are not always visible year by year. They accumulate in the way that soil health accumulates underground, invisible, measurable, only when you dig down and hold the result in your hands and compare it to what you held before. What Dellwood County looked like in the 5th year after the drought was not the result of any single decision, but of 10,000 decisions made by 50 people in fields and barns and cooperative meetings and kitchen tables, most of them small, a few of them consequential, all of them adding up. Nora stood on the farmhouse porch on a late September evening when she was 37 years old and watched the sun move down through colors that only the Midwest sky produces, violet into gold, into a thin line of orange at the horizon, and looked out at a farm that was not the farm she had inherited. The Calloway property now ran to 1,200 acres, including the South Ridge tract, and a parcel from the cooperative allocation that bordered the North Field. It was not monoculture. What she looked at was a working mosaic, fields of purple alfalfa, alternating with winter wheat in deep green crimson clover plots in their nitrogen-fixing role along every hedgerow, the buckwheat in its seasonal rotation returning to the ground that had made her name. Down in the valley, the honey extraction facility that she and Ed co-owned operated year-round, now processing product from 2,000 colonies across a dozen varietals, shipping to culinary markets in 12 states and 4 countries. Ed was 67 and moved more slowly between the hive rows than he once had, but he moved with a certainty about where each foot was going that he had not had 5 years ago. He had not lived in his Airstream for 3 seasons. There was a small house on the eastern edge of the property that he occupied with the slightly surprised air of a man who had not expected to put down roots anywhere and had found himself doing it anyway. Warren Holt arrived at 6 in the evening in his ordinary truck, the old flatbed he had been driving since the Platinum edition was sold to cover debt restructuring costs. He was the cooperative's operations director, a role that suited him in ways that Farming King had not, because it required him to be effective rather than impressive, and effectiveness was something he had always possessed and had spent 20 years packaging incorrectly. He climbed the porch steps and handed Nora a clipboard. "Final yield numbers from the North units," he said. "The winter wheat is up 20% from baseline thanks to last year's clover nitrogen cycle. Walt Greer is telling the story to anyone who will listen, which at this point is mostly the cooperative newsletter. Nora took the clipboard and read through the numbers. They were good numbers. They were the kind of numbers that make a farm a legacy instead of a liability. Water table, she asked. Holding, Holtz said. He nodded toward the old artesian well, which was surrounded now by a restored pond that had drawn back the wildlife the drought years had displaced. Herons worked the shallows in the mornings. The root mass from the mixed perennial system is holding soil moisture at depth. We ran a dry simulation last spring, 60 days without rain on paper. The models say we don't lose an acre. He looked at the pond and at the fields beyond it and at the sky going down behind the western tree line. Something had changed in Warren Holt's face over 5 years that was not just age. It was the particular quality of a man who has been reduced to his actual size by events and has found, somewhat to his own surprise, that his actual size is enough. You built something real here, he said. We built something real, Nora said. He accepted the correction with a nod and went down the porch steps and drove away, and the truck's taillights moved down the long gravel drive and turned onto the county road and disappeared. Tommy came out through the screen door with 2 cups of coffee and sat in the other chair. He was 29 now and carried himself with an ease that he had not had at 24, the ease of a person who knows what they are doing and has stopped apologizing for the route that brought them there. He was enrolled in his 2nd year of the Sustainable Agriculture program at Iowa State, doing the coursework online in the evenings, and he ran the cooperative's equipment operation with a competence that had impressed even Walt Greer, which was the hardest standard in the county. They sat in the fading light and drank their coffee and watched the last colors leave the sky. Carolyn called, Tommy said. The school program had 40 kids out here last week from the Delwood Elementary. She said 3 of them asked their parents if they could have a beehive. Nora smiled. Carolyn had built the cooperative's education program from nothing using her 9 years of classroom experience and the particular energy of a person doing the work they were always meant to do after years of waiting. The program brought children and community groups to working farms across the cooperative, and it had become, in a quiet and local way, one of the things that Delwood County was known for. Dale stopped by this morning while you were in the East Field, Tommy said. He said the EPA cited Omniagra in 3 separate county actions across the state this year. The Delwood data Iris published is being used in the federal rulemaking process for aerial application buffer zones. Nora listened to the evening settle around the farm, the particular acoustic quality of a place that is alive, the faint consistent note from the hive rose, even in September, the sound of the wind in the mature sunflowers along the perimeter, the creak of the old farmhouse finding its position in the cooling air. She set her coffee down and stood up. I need to do something, she said. The walk to the oak grove took 10 minutes along the path she had worn into the grass herself over 5 years of walking it, past the sunflower rows that now served as the farm's permanent perimeter, their stems as thick as broom handles, their faces turned on seasonal rotation following the light, past the south field where the crimson clover was in its 3rd cutting of the season, past the restored pond where a single great blue heron stood in the shallows in the last light motionless, waiting with the patience of something that has learned to trust that what it needs will come. The oak grove was the oldest part of the property. The trees had been here before the first Callaway broke ground, before the county existed, before anyone decided this particular arrangement of soil and water and air was worth naming. Under the oldest tree at the base, where the roots had lifted the ground into a low ridge, was the granite headstone that Nora had placed in the first year. Gerald Callaway, beloved father, he loved the land. She knelt in the grass. The earth here was dark and loose and full, nothing like the cracked ceramic surface it had been 5 years ago. The difference between soil that has been worked to exhaustion and soil that has been given back to itself. She had done this deliberately, keeping this ground in a deep-rooted perennial mix that built organic matter and biological activity so that the earth around her father's grave would be the richest earth on the property. A honeybee came in low over the grass, tracking the last of the season's white buckwheat flowers she had planted at the base of the stone every year since the first one. The bee landed on a cluster of blossoms with the focused economy of a creature that has evolved to do exactly this one thing perfectly and work the flowers with a thoroughness that was its own kind of tribute. Nora reached into the inside pocket of her jacket. The photocopy was soft now from years of folding and unfolding the paper, gone translucent at the creases, but her father's handwriting in the upper corner was still clear, blue ballpoint slightly cramped. Try this someday, and the question mark that had waited 30 years for its answer. She set it against the base of the stone under the buckwheat flowers, where the light was still strong enough to read it. "We tried it, Dad," she said. The wind moved through the oak leaves above her. The bee finished its work on one blossom and moved to the next with the unhurried confidence of a creature operating in its right environment. Somewhere across the field, the hives were settling into their evening frequency, lower and slower than the daytime hum, the sound of 2,000 colonies preparing for the dark. She stayed there until the last of the light was gone. Then she folded the paper back into her pocket, stood up, and walked back through the fields toward the farmhouse, where Tommy had left a light burning in the kitchen window, a small yellow square in the Iowa dark, the simplest possible signal that someone was waiting, that the day was not quite done, that there was still coffee and still work and still the particular good exhaustion that comes from building something that will outlast you. She had inherited $2 million of debt and a piece of broken ground. She had faced the arrogance of men who measured everything by what it was worth to them in a transaction. She had faced a sky that stopped raining. She had faced a corporate machine that moved through communities the way weather moves through crops, indifferent to what it destroyed. She had faced a town that laughed at her, and a bank that had already written her off, and a brother who had needed to be shown before he could believe. She had not beaten any of these things with force or money or the kind of power that requires someone else to have less of it. She had beaten them with 45-day plants and 10 million wings with the question mark her father wrote in the margin of a journal article in 1987 and never had time to answer, with the understanding that exhausted land is not dead, land that broken communities are not finished, communities that the things worth building take longer than a season and cost more than a balance sheet can measure and return more than any single person can claim. The kitchen light held steady in the window. She walked toward it through the dark Iowa fields, through the smell of living soil and late-season clover, and the faint, persistent sweetness that hung over the land in all seasons. Now, the way certain things once established simply continue,